Welcome to the second part of this episode, looking at whether screen time and media content may be inadvertently increasing the risk of youth to future substance abuse. In this episode, I am joined by Dr. Melissa Cox, assistant professor at East Carolina University, to discuss media influences among youth and risk of substance use, and what parents can do to intervene. Dr. Cox presents some compelling results from research conducted by herself and colleagues. If you are a parent or plan to be one in the future, I particularly advise you to listen until the end so you can gain valuable information and skills that you can put into effect immediately.
Hi, Elena, it's Melissa.
Hi, Melissa. Thank you so much for being here with me. So when I went to the Substance Use Prevention Conference and heard your talk at the very end of it, I was fascinated by the research you did, but also honestly a little alarmed at the statistics. Could you share with us some of those, like what's the prevalence of media use with youth in the U.S. today?
Yeah, so there's been a couple organizations that have been trying to track, media use in different age groups. And honestly, it's pretty hard to do to get a really quantifiable estimate. But across studies, what we're seeing is that when we think about the middle childhood years, so the 8 to 12-year-old range, most of them are actively engaged with a screen of some sort for about 5 hours a day. And then, as you might expect, that number goes up quite a bit for later children and into adolescence, so the 13 to 18-year-olds. And on average, we're seeing about 7 hours of screen time a day. And now that's across devices. So that could be on a computer or laptop, that could be on a tablet, it could be going to the movies if they're still going to the movies, although that's not as popular anymore. Certainly uses of cell phones. So that's across devices, but it's quite a few hours. If you think about it, 7 hours for a 13 to 18-year-old, I mean, most parents don't interact with their children for that number of hours a day. It's pretty much the amount that they're in school. So if you think about a 24-hour day, that's quite a bit. And I think one thing that is important to think about and why these numbers might be as high as they are, because I agree, I think it's pretty alarming when you first hear them, but then when you think about all of the ways that children can access media, it's really changed. And in some ways, we sort of think about old media as being traditional television on the television set, or movies that were playing at the movie theater, and music. That's sort of the old media, if you will, which is still important, but it changes quite a bit now that we're in what we call sort of a new media environment. So this is the internet environment. And so now, not only do you have access to media on websites in general, but you certainly have much more access using personal handheld devices. You have constant streaming of movies and television, so the access is so much greater than it used to be, and we're using these types of devices in so many ways. So I think that's sort of what's behind these increases in numbers. But yeah, you're right, they are quite alarming.
Definitely alarming because, as you said, the 7 hours is more than some parents spend with their children. And I remember when I was a child, I spent maybe 7 hours outside. My parents restricted our use with TV and media devices, and I remember I always complained about it because I said how everyone else used to have a phone when they were really young and watch TV whenever they wanted, and my sisters and I were restricted from doing that. And from the research that I've learned today, including your research, I'm honestly thankful for that I was able to spend so much time outside. And
there's a lot of benefits to that.
There is. It's with using so much of these social media devices, you can't really get in a more confined and closed environment than that, which is pretty sad. But for those statistics you shared with use of social media, is that including or excluding those used for educational purposes?
So those are including educational purposes. So I think that's a really good point to make, is that a lot of the studies that we have on terms of how much they're spending on devices is across the board. And another thing that is really important to make sure people understand is that not all media is bad. I'm going to talk a lot about the risks of media, and that's what a lot of our research is on. But screen time and the use of devices can be really educational. It can be really important in terms of fostering certain social connections for certain groups. So I do want to make that clear that media is not bad. Screen time is not bad overall. It's just how much and in the ways that they're interacting with the media. But yeah, that's a good point. Most of our studies of the hours do include, pro-social and positive interactions with devices and media.
Okay, I definitely agree. It's not all bad for these devices, but I guess thinking for maybe negative influences, why should we be thinking about media influences on youth behavior, as well as typical social factors such as peers and schools?
Yeah, great question. So I think one way to sort of conceptualize this is that a lot of times in our field, in health behavior, we think about an individual's behavior. You certainly have a lot of characteristics within the individual, and those certainly play a role in their decision-making and how they act. But we also think about what we call these nested spheres of influence, and this is based on a theory called the social ecological model. But what it translates to is that there are these circles of influence, and the first closest layer to the individual are the people that they interact with on a daily basis. So these individuals have a lot of influence on their behavior. So these are your parents, your peers, your teachers. Again, those people that they're interacting with regularly. And then beyond those people, we have the institutions that they're interacting with. So school, church, any type of activities. And then we can move up from there to wider policy and culture. And so I say this because I think it's a way of sort of framing how the media can influence a youth's individual behavior. Because now, when we know that they're interacting, especially with personal handheld devices, they're interacting with these devices and screens at rates and amounts that's higher than they're interacting with their parents and peers. So that's now really close influence for them on a daily basis. And then if we move beyond that, so the institutions and then into the culture, we have the industry behind that. And the media industry is really powerful, and they are really, really good at marketing to youth. So much of what we do in research is trying to catch up with what they know in industry. And so they're relaying messages to youth through the media about substance use all the time. And when we think about how media sort of exerts this risk, we have to think about the level of exposure that youth have to the media. So this can be through media promotions, it could be through advertisements, it could be through brand placements, in movies and in TV shows and in music. So there's lots of ways that the media is sort of getting their message about substance use across to youth. And sometimes that's explicit and sometimes it's implicit. And so, for example, just thinking about movies, so we know that 90% of PG-13 and more than 90% of R-rated films have substance use references in them. And that is really high, but maybe you would expect that. But 60% of G and PG-rated films have inferences of substance use. So that, I think, kind of shows you how pervasive it is. And that's just movies. Again, you have television, you have YouTube videos, you have online marketing on social media. I mean, it's everywhere. And so when we think about how much time kids are spending on screens where media can exert this influence, that's where we're really worried about this level of risk.
Did you say that 60% of G and PG rated movies have some sort of alcohol and drug exposure in it?
Yes, and that study was actually from several years ago, so it may very well be higher at this point. And we do know, so cigarette and tobacco marketing in films and TV has gone down, and that is from the Surgeon General put out a report several years ago, but a lot of that is stemming from the master settlement with the tobacco industry. And one of the ramifications of that is that they were required to not have this type of brand exposure and advertisements in the media. So we have seen a decline in cigarettes, but that has not been the case for the other substances. So we've seen increases in alcohol, and most certainly now we don't have the data, but one would expect we're likely seeing seeing more inferences of marijuana use and some other drugs. But yeah, that's in 60% of G and PG rated movies.
I don't even know what classifies as a G-rated movie today, but that's pretty crazy to me, because I'm thinking of, I don't know, animated movies for kids that I love myself, and to think that normally the storyline behind those have some, moral lesson, but it's kind of alarming thinking that there's some exposure with alcohol and other drugs that would come across as positive to the kids or whoever's watching them.
Right. And I think that's where, these substance use references, sometimes they're really in your face and you can't miss them. And sometimes they're not. But even those ones that are not, when they build time and time again, that's where they can still have, exert risk. And I think one thing to sort of put out there is how this risk is conferred. So what is it about these media exposures that is really getting to children and to youth? And I think there's a couple ways that we can think about it. So one is that we know one really powerful influence on behavior is imitation. So youth in particular will imitate the behavior that they see from others, particularly others that they feel are important to them. So this is why, parents drinking has been such an important factor that we've looked at in terms of adolescent drinking. We know that teens who witness and engage in drinking with their parents are more likely to experience higher levels of drinking and consequences of drinking. But the same goes for other types of influence. And the characters, if you will, I say that not in an animated sense, but just the people in the media that are drinking, sometimes are referred to as super peers. So this idea that youth can feel really connected to these individuals, whether it's in a TV show or a movie, and they look up to them in some ways or want to be like them in other ways. And so that imitation of behavior could happen based on those characters' own behavior. But then we can also think about how the media can exert this influence in more indirect ways. So what this means is, like, when we think about kind of socializing a child or youth to a behavior, so for instance, drinking alcohol, that if they are only witnessing really positive outcomes of that substance use, and we know that the vast, vast majority of substance use references in media are pro-social in nature, meaning they have positive outcomes and they don't show the negative outcomes associated with that use. And so if youth are seeing all of these inferences about substance use in that way, then their norms and their attitudes and their beliefs about substance use are being shaped. So what they're seeing is you drink and people have fun. You drink and you become connected to a romantic partner. You smoke and you feel better. They see all of that, but they don't see the hangovers. They don't see, the other physical and social consequences. And so that's really shaping their beliefs about that substance use. And we know that that's a really powerful influence on behavior. So again, there's kind of these different ways that we can think about how the media is influencing behavior.
How does that compare to, I'm thinking of some anti-drug campaigns like, let's say, DARE, and the intent is to kind of show the negative consequences associated with using drugs, but they really weren't found to be that effective in reducing initiation of substance use. What exactly would make those programs more effective?
Yeah, so that's a good question. DARE's a unique example because DARE itself has changed a lot over the years, and you're right that a lot of the initial evaluations of DARE showed that they weren't effective at all. And a lot of that has been sort of thought about in the way that they delivered the prevention, if you will. But if we think about other types of prevention programming, so for families or in schools, a lot of it actually has to do with those intermediary concepts I was just talking about. So, you could have some type of social norms campaign in a school, because we know that the most students, both in high school and when they move on to college, overestimate how much their peers are using substances. And when they do, they have a higher risk of using themselves. And so you might have these types of, whether it's a normative campaign, whether it's personalized normative feedback that's trying to lower the reference point that they have about their peer use. So that's one thing. Another is there's quite a few prevention programs that are really not only trying to change that sort of knowledge and awareness, but also give very specific behavioral skills about resisting offers, for example. And so I think that programs across the board have tried to find ways to counteract what these media messages, and it's not just media, of course, there's plenty of other influences. So we're trying to counteract those ways in which this risk for substance use develops throughout adolescence and then plays out in terms of their own substance use behavior.
How about at home in the household when parents are present? Based on your own research, what sort of restrictions from parents can be enforced, and how does that play a role in risk on youth substance use?
So in terms of parenting in general or specifically for media?
Parenting, I guess, sort of parenting style, or also just restrictions on what their children can view in terms of the rating of the movies?
Yeah, sure. So when we think about parenting in general and how it relates to youth substance use, there's a couple sort of key things we think about. And one, just as you mentioned, is parenting style. And this is the idea that parents who show a really high level of support for their children and parents that exert a developmentally appropriate level of control, so control over their activities and their whereabouts and who they're with, we know that that is protective of substance use. But then parents can also enact these really specific socialization practices for substances. And this could include things like talking very concretely about alcohol use, for example. So relaying those messages to children about the negative consequences of alcohol, trying to counter some of these other messages that they are receiving, setting very clear rules and boundaries about substance use in the home and outside of the home. So these are all ways that that parents can try and mitigate the risk that young people are facing for substance use across the board. And then in terms of media, there's been some really great work. So one of my colleagues, her name is Joy Gabrielli, she's right now at Dartmouth, and her colleagues have developed this parenting framework to promote effective media management, and it's called TECH, which is really easy to remember. And what they're trying to do is help parents. Yeah, it's a great acronym. But what they're trying to do is help parents have the understanding and the skills about media to communicate and to appropriately direct their youth behavior around media. And I think this is hard because, quite honestly, a lot of youth are much more adept at media and using devices than parents are. And a lot of parents feel overwhelmed about where to even start. And so they use this acronym, TECH. And the first one is T is for talking to your kids about media use. So asking them questions about what shows they like, what are they watching, how are they perceiving what they're watching, what are their friends watching. So having these periodic check-ins that's sort of a starting point for bigger conversations about substance use in particular, but it could also be other risk behaviors. And then the E is for educating your child about risks or wrong information. And this gets back to what I was talking about earlier, that so often, only the positive effects, if you will, of substance use are portrayed. And so being able to tell them that that's not actually the case, that's not reality. So talking about the negative consequences, but then also being really explicit about how the industry is promoting substance use. And so sort of talking about what it means to have brands placed in your favorite TV show and how companies use ads in order to get their message across. So that's the E. And then the C is for co-viewing or co-use of media. So that's actively, and the emphasis there is on actively watching media with your child. And so, of course, you just want to view age-appropriate content. But when those behaviors, again, whether it's, risky sexual behaviors or substance use, when it occurs, use that as a teachable moment to talk about use and the consequences of use. And so, if parents are just passively watching these shows that have this type of commentary in it and not reacting, that could actually be perceived by the child as being permissive. So there's a sort of implicit assumption that those things are okay because the parents aren't saying anything about it. So using those exposures as you're watching together as a point of opportunity to talk about substance use. And then the H is for setting really clear house rules. So, for instance, not having screens in kids' bedrooms, not allowing mature adult content, using the different types of technology that we have to limit children's screen time, those sorts of things. So setting really clear house rules and enforcing them, that can really help with lowering the risk associated with media. And I can send you the link so that you can post the tech parenting, but I think it's a really simple way. It's a great starting place for parents in terms of what they can do about media.
Yeah, that's great. And the acronym is very easy to remember. So that's very useful. I will definitely keep that in mind for when I'm a parent. So aside from media use, like just screen time is what I'm primarily thinking of. Has there been any research with audio, such as songs from artists? So I say this because after I was reading about your research and thinking about the talk that you had, I recently went to a concert, one of my favorite artists, and, he has a song that is actually about suicide prevention that is very popular. But then he also has a couple songs in which he consistently refers to alcohol and marijuana use. And I was sort of blown away because at this concert, everywhere I looked, it seemed as if there were primarily 14-year-olds. And when he called on a few people in the audience, I think out of 4 people that he called on, 2 of them were 14. And I was thinking, when he was singing the song, I mean, even in the name of the song is, I think, weed or marijuana or something. So do you know about any research on music influences on youth? And is that, somewhat similar on risk of substance abuse?
Yes, it definitely is. And I think that's a really good example because, right there you have, I'm sure those young people were screaming and being excited and they clearly love this performer. And you really feel connected to those individuals, which is why what they say and what they do holds importance in their own behavior. And so right there, just in that one concert, they're being told over and over and over again that this person who, again, has some sort of important influence in their life is talking about substance use. So that's positive. Those are positive connections that are being made. And there has been really similar work done to what we're doing in terms of movies and new media and music. So Brian Premack is a researcher who's looked at this, and he found pretty widespread substance use references across music genres. I think that's the other thing, too. Certainly it's higher in some genres, but for the most part, across genres, you see these really explicit references to substance use. And the same principles that I've been talking about apply. So from imitating behaviors to changing those expectancies and attitudes about substance use to a lot of times this also changes their willingness to try substance use. So all of those influences play out with music just like they do for television. And I think in the presentation, I used the example and showed the Luke Bryan song. So this is arguably, one of the top 5 most popular country music stars, and his albums don't have any sort of parental guidance on them or anything, and yet he has a song called Drunk on You. That's the title of it. And the whole premise, there's explicit references to Crown. The whole premise is, it's the summertime, you're having fun, you're hanging out, he's trying to get a girl, and the whole thing is about substance use. And that's Luke Bryan in a country concert. And so, yes, it's quite widespread. And you mentioned marijuana. That also has increased in terms of how often it's referenced in music lyrics. And not only do you have the songs that they're listening to, but you have the videos that go along with it. And we might not be watching the videos, but youth watch those music videos, which are readily available on YouTube, so they can watch them at any time. And they see that in addition to hearing it.
I'm actually guilty of watching some of the music videos because I love watching movies and they're almost like just 2-3 minute movie clips. So I love them. But like you mentioned, in a lot of them, there is such a high prevalence of alcohol and marijuana use. Youth also are, actually anyone. It's pretty easy after listening to a song time after time that you're going to memorize the lyrics. So when I think about media use and just listening to music, you can listen multiple times throughout the day, and if you're doing a workout, and if you have that song memorized and those lyrics, and youth don't really associate anything negative with them except a positive influence or a consequence, I would think, that would have a large effect on their behavior.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's just music. They're getting it, again, from social media advertisements to, advertisements that are just on the side of Google to things they're explicitly watching and listening to. So that adds up a lot within a day, and it certainly adds up over weeks and months in terms of exposure.
Right. So based on your research or just research in general, aside from the difference in exposure time to media use among different age groups, have you or others found any gender differences? A recent article came out in BMC Public Health, and it was a longitudinal study that looked at children from ages 10 to 15. And so they looked at their social media interactions when they were 10 years old, and then assessed what their well-being was at a later point, and found that only among females, but not males, greater use of social media at age 10 was associated with declined well-being. And maybe I'm not sure what other factors might play a part in that declined well-being for males if social media doesn't play a part. But have you identified any gender differences with your research?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in some of the work that we've done with movies, we haven't really been able to explore those gender differences in the ways that we would want to, just some limitations with the data. But I think that this is a really important next step in general in terms of media influences on youth. And you were talking about the connection between media and mental health, and I think we definitely have seen some established gender differences there. To the extent that it plays out in substance use is where we need quite a bit more work. And part of that is trying to figure out whether or not those processes of how media exerts risk, are those different for girls as compared to boys? And some studies have said, have not found gender differences, but that we haven't looked at everything. So I think it's a really important thing to consider. In particular, what we do know, so a lot of our national data sets have seen an increase in substance use among our female youth in the last 5 to 7 years. So overall, and I'm sure you've sort of seen it in the press, we've seen these declines, in alcohol use and in binge drinking, historical shift downward, which is great. That does, but we've got to keep going. But those declines right now are largely being driven by declines in males' involvement in substance use. On the flip side, we're seeing higher rates of involvement among females, not only how often they're using substances, but also that they're using at much higher levels. So these sort of extreme binge drinking, if you will. So we know that there's something going on in terms of females increasing their use. And I think that that's one area that we really need to explore more to try and dig into what these mechanisms are and how they might differ for young men and versus young women. So I think it's a really important question. And like I said, our research hasn't looked at that explicitly, but it's an important topic to consider.
Wow, I actually was not aware of that, but thank you for sharing that. I will definitely be looking out for any research that comes out. Hopefully they can figure that out soon.
Yeah, exactly. It is quite alarming. So Megan Petrick is an author. She's at the University of Michigan, and her and her colleagues have been tracking quite a bit of this, both in high school and then into young adulthood, and seeing these differences in developmental patterns between males and females. It's really quite striking.
Yeah, very striking. Is there anything further that you would like to add? You gave some great advice for parents, and especially if they want to check out that tech, the acronym that you mentioned before, but is there anything else you'd like to let anyone who's listening know?
Yeah, I think we covered most of it. I think that, just having some confidence that parents can do something about it, that parents are still important, when it comes to influence in youth lives. It doesn't dissipate even as peers become more influential. Parents are really important, and they will continue to be so even as this media landscape is changing. And yes, it's changing quickly, and I think it can feel quite overwhelming, but we do know some things that work and will continue to work. So things like the tech parenting, and you've got to start somewhere and then continue to build on that. And I also think it's important, when it comes to these types of issues like substance use, that we've got to take a multi-pronged approach, right? It's not just parents, it's not just peers, it's not just schools, it's not just church, but it's that youth are getting these sort of preventive messages, if you will, and they're reinforced across these different networks that they're associated with. And so the more that we can do to change the environment in these different places will help, because all of that builds together in terms of promoting health, promoting well-being, and keeping kids away from these riskier behaviors.
I love that multi-pronged approach idea. I definitely completely 100% enforce that. So great advice. Thank you, Melissa, so much. Thank you for listening to the second part of this episode. Be sure to look for related resources, some of which were mentioned in this episode, on jphmpdirect.com. Next time, I will discuss non-pharmacological interventions for prevention and treatment of substance use disorder, including sound therapy and mindfulness meditation.